I want to welcome all of you to this month's Critical Connections. And our purpose, mission at Critical Connections is to enhance and expand critical writing, critical discourse in the field of ceramics. And today I want to, Linda Lighton was going to be joining us. She has in the past been our major funder to be able to help me pay our presenters. And I want to thank Kurt Benzel for his generous donation recently. Thank you. And without further ado, I don't spend a lot of time on introductions, Rebecca, because I send that information out ahead of time, and your presentation will tell us all we need to know. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for having me today, and Diane for your graciousness and reaching out. And I'm going to do a quick overview on my work and also give you a little sneak peek at the recent installation at the Everson Museum in Syracuse that just closed, and then also try to tie or discuss my connection and tie to my field in clay. So I'm going to cover those items. I'm going to start here by giving you just sort of a quick peek at an introduction of kind of my methodology. I'm an installation artist. I am building in museums and with invitations to use the square footage within the museum. And with that comes a wonderful opportunity to research place and to research aspects about place. So I'm considering not only the physical architecture of the space, but also really beginning to kind of, expand and look at dynamics of place that I learn and to try to incorporate. So all my work is site installed and connecting for the most part to the architecture after being what I hope is being very sensitive to place and to the architecture and to the invitation, the gracious invitation to use space. So I'm just giving you a quick peek at what I make. Room size pieces, large and small rooms, tall and shorter ceilings, all kinds of dynamics that I work with. And this is a little peek at the Everson, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So everything is well planned, because for me, the projects are more marathon projects. They generally are a year in the making, and sometimes a year and a half in the making. So there's lots of communication. That's also kind of the connection to place. So I get to have that human connection with staff and the museum, and I'm very well of the footprint, the photos of the space, and then it's back to the studio and really digging in on some of the backstory, the research of what I could possibly use, what kind of form might be influenced by the information. And then parts are made or structure is made, and all of that then goes to the museum. And I am sited right at the museum 5 or 6 days minimum and building out within the space. So I'm going to now that I've given you a tiny little introduction that I'm an installation artist, I'm going to go into the Everson project, which was a piece that I have worked on for the last year plus. And it was incredibly different in a lot of ways and similar in a lot of ways. There was this gracious invitation to use the space. The space is lovely, quiet, very roomy, and then to dig into, what is it about Syracuse that's dynamic and interesting that I could dig into? And so for me, the research took me to two really key points, and that is a long-standing history of Syracuse china, a beautiful industry that was very vibrant for over 200 years, and the story of that industry, that is about immigration, and that the mold maker came from England, and then the glazer came by immigration, and that it was built from pieces of knowledge. And as we know in the story and the history of ceramics, decline occurred in all sorts of industries around the United States due to lifestyle changes, Tupperware, Corningware, lots of different aspects that changed forever the cost of making ware. So Syracuse, China closed. And so I decided to use an inverted vessel. And I knew I've never done that. But I wanted to use that connection to vessel, but I wanted to do it in a unique way. And the other piece of the research that really stood out for me that really is a beautiful story was a story about understanding that Syracuse, what economics was built on Syracuse, China, and also mining, soda ash mining, and that there is an industrial residue and an industrial past, and that within that industrial stridation and layers of history and physicalness to the soil, pollution actually encouraged an algae that grew in and around Syracuse region. And this algae had this, sort of unique connection to a very rare orchid that needed this algae to thrive. And the Spinata ordata grew, can't be found within 450 miles of Syracuse, but found what it needed. That was just two pieces of the research that just really got me going in my connection. And so I decided I was going to use surface in that sort of blue and white historical tradition of ceramics, and I was going to enliven the surface with these orchids, these rare orchids. So it's a peek here. I'm going to take you around the installation. And I started the drawings, and then I actually collaborated with wonderful artist Mallory Weatherall. And I asked her, will you touch the drawings? And then I'm going to close out. So she articulated the orchids, and then I came back and I sort of punched shadowing areas and other things. So 6 of the forms are drawn on, and the other forms are all made from upcycled, discarded, landfill bound book and book pages. I collected the book pages and then would dip them into a slurry, a mixture of a fiber and a clay. That's traditional in my work, and I'll talk more about that upcoming, but sort of a paper clay slurry. And then each book page folded, and then I built these forms, and I built the forms inverted, upside down. And traditionally in ceramic arts, we all know that coil building is from the, sort of table up or ground up. And I'm using all my knowledge there in terms of building these forms. And I'll take you through that. But for me, one of the, key aspects of installation making is that I'm also thinking about the space I'm creating, the space that I'm accommodating, and I'm aware of the negative space between forms, and I'm creating what hopefully is an experience. I mean, that is truly, kind of a departure point from object making to installation making. That I'm creating an experience. I'm creating a physical experience. And the Everson told me they had all of the 5th graders in Syracuse at the installation. And so I'm sure it was extremely well physically experienced by thousands of 5th graders at the Everson. But I site installed, all the forms were pre-made and then site connected in the museum over 5 days with help, with lots of help. The woodworking is simple. These are very light. They're 8 or 9 pounds each, although they're 10 feet tall. And so I'm really playing with kind of turning ceramics on its head, literally in its weight. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with my connection to the field and my connection to the material. But they're very, very lightweight. So I'm doing very simple woodworking, connecting to the ceiling and thinking again about accommodation and the spatial experience, moving around these sort of very large volumetric inverted vessels and being able to physically move around them. I often thought about, when I'm working, truth of materials. So I often didn't cover my tracks. So you can see the writing on the pages if the slurry was thin. You can see where, two halves are almost touching and decided to kind of leave, all of that truth within the form. Because to be honest, many of these forms were built with 3 layers. So I would build the volumetric sort of vessel form, and then I would build another layer until it poofed out, till it volumetrically moved out to what felt like it had strong presence. So you can actually look underneath and see the history of making. And sometimes you can actually see the history of making through seams and so on. So I left a lot of sort of very truthful encounter to the process of making. All the drawings are just Indian ink, just a blue Indian ink, and then they're painted and drawn on just with an Asian brush, and then I sprayed them so that they're archivally tight. I went a little quick there. There are 12 forms. The gallery space was about 38 feet by 25 feet. So nice big space. And then when you're at the back of the gallery, you can look out, and Garth Johnson, the head curator, asked me to use the next gallery space across the hall. It is a small, intimate space. And he said, give me 3 options. So I did. I gave him some prints to look at. I gave him some drawings to look at, and so on and so forth. And he says, I want a retrospect of your drawings, and I'll take you now to those. The drawings are really kind of my pre-warm up of my making. So I first draw in a sketchbook just to kind of, in idle times, just to capture thoughts on research I've been doing, but how form might look within the research I've been thinking about. But then I generally go really large scale, right to a large piece of vellum, so that I can begin to feel scale, and I can begin to kind of really have that relationship with my body. So this is how I warm up to making installation. And he chose, I think, 30 drawings. And my lovely assistant Addie helped me figure out how we could keep them still very airy, so they could have a connection to the installation across the hallway. And they were just sandwiched between these 2 pieces of molding, and they hung sort of in layers to kind of continue the installation feel. I'm going to put my work in context for just a few minutes. And this is a very abbreviated lecture because I know you want to get to some points to really chew on and to discuss. I look at nature, the formal beauty of nature. I'm particularly interested in the behavior of nature. Nature as nature changes. So as a mineral and water mixes and might drip into stalactite or stalagmite, or a river rises in level and sort of deposits the sediment around boundaries. So sticks and other things kind of gather around trees. So I'm really interested in this, sort of the behavior that I see in nature. Love looking at the engineering and the awe in the engineering, the determination, the wherewithal, the ability. And ultimately, I'm interested in both being human and species, and how we connect to place, and within our human development, how thoughtful we are in terms of architectural theory, how sensitive we are to place, or the lack of sensitivity, and then looking at examples within the animal world as well. This is true to the process. It's old-fashioned hard work. It is planning for a year and a half, and then often on a cherry picker or on a dolly, and just building piece by piece by piece, or weaving thread by thread by thread, whatever the process might be. But it's just really good old-fashioned hard work. Everything is about accumulation. It's the repetition and the accumulation in my work. And I'm going to zip through this series so you can kind of get a sense of my connection to my material and my connection to the field. I have been traditionally trained, Berea College, as an undergrad in ceramics, and a graduate program, University of Georgia, Athens, Georgia. And while I was in graduate school, I also trained with a paper maker for 2 years, Charlie Morgan. And I always thought that was a separate interest, but found postgraduate school. And actually, as a long-term Archie Bray resident artist for 2 years, I was there 2 years, I began to find how my sources, my research, and my materials really literally could be connected, and found that it's Adobe. And Adobe provides so much structural ingenuity. And for me, then looking at species and seeing how they're blending materials it began to make sense. So I'm blending my knowledge, but I'm literally blending my materials, handmade paper and clay, so that I have this wonderful, strong, thick mud that I can work with. Everything is part making and assemble. So again, repetition and assemblage, piece by piece by piece, dipping into that mud of adobe and sticking onto a simple framework. Again, I shared with you, I do a lot of simple woodworking. The woodworking is willow. It's harvested from my property or near my property in Helena, Montana, where I spend 3 months every year working in the studio. It's a wonderful wood. I strip the bark and then can make structure, or I weave. So there is a structural component, which is holding things together. And here's handmade paper making. I'm completely outfitted with Hollander beater and can pull sheets. I can pour sheets. I can pull paint in my studio practice. Here's the inside of my studio, and you're seeing that the handmade paper is in repetition, piece after piece, hanging to dry, or I'm upcycling industrial paper. Interesting enough, industrial papers have a percent of clay. There is kaolin in the industrial paper making process. So I found that very interesting that it's the industrial papers, when blunged, already have a mush and a gush like paper clay. I'm just adding more clay to it. Everything's in repetition. This is, I'm speaking to you today in my studio on the East Coast, where I live south of Boston, and work in the studio, as well as share in the mentorship of young emerging professionals. I am head of the ceramics department, UMass Dartmouth, where I have a large graduate program. But my West studio is in Helena, and I work in a very large barn space. And it is absolutely gracious in terms of making sculptures, really great. And that's the view outside the studio. So you get a kind of sense of place where that is. And you're seeing a lot of my materials here organized by color and texture. And I'm using clay on paper, whether it's handmade paper, I'm spraying paper clay, I'm upcycling and cutting old books, I'm making forms and using those forms. But ultimately, and here I'm starting to build, this is how I built the Everson pieces, saturated paper clay pieces, one piece at a time. One piece at a time. Here I'm folding, dipping, and sticking until the form begins to fill out. So it's not too unlike, these Everson pieces are not too unlike paper mache, if you can visualize that, but in this case, it's sort of paper clay mache. So for me, my relationship with my field and my material has always been what and how can I be experimental with my materials? How can my material be so diverse that I can move the form in any direction I need to match not only my interior architecture, my autobiography, my connection to self, but also how can I connect it to the research of place? And then develop methods of making. So here you see the hollow forms, the Everson on their way. I often use liquid clay, dipping and working around, a little armature that's on the top left, or squirting onto the plaster slab. But really, and here, allowing the clay to dry till it's hard. And I call this hard construction. And it's very much like Lincoln log structure. Because of the adobe, because of the paper clay, it's very, very strong. And I can build very quickly with any method in any shape that I make, just by dipping and sticking. As I've done here for this installation at the Danforth Museum, where I use that Lincoln log hard construction piece by piece by piece, and working in 3-foot sections, firing 3-foot sections, stacking them on top of each other, and then navigating bloom activity around the forms. That was a piece very much about midnight activity in my garden, like what's actually happening. I shared this at the very beginning. This was at the Holter Museum of Art, very tall ceiling. It was all about spatial accommodation, allowing blooms to have the room they needed to thrive. So I created these spacer sticks everywhere in the form, up 32-foot ceiling, Racine Museum of Art. Piece for Scripps National, where there was a woven form and the bloom activity happened inside and outside. A piece that I built for University of North Carolina, Charlotte, using industrial surplus. Many of the projects, all of the projects have connection to place. Many of the projects have really interesting surplus from industry. This was the bedding industry, and they gave me cotton thread ends, and I used them to weave from the bottom up around 29 to 30 feet. And then I would wrap the warp structure around it and do a second layer. And see, on the image on the left, you can actually see the layers of the weave, up to 3 and 4 layers until the form took presence. Another piece I built for Washington State University, Pullman. Very simple, quiet space, 16 forms sort of just gently dripping like sort of a sack or a drip of a water drip. Another piece that I built at University of Washington, Seattle, working with the horticulture department, and they were doing invasive research, and I got to team up with a group of people, and we were just literally harvesting loose strife and invasive plant material, and I brought it back into the gallery space, dipped it into a slurry, and built form. So you can see there's a variety of materials that I'm mixing with the paper clay. Here I made 1,000 sheets of handmade paper, coated them in clay, and built at Manchester Crafts in Pittsburgh. And I built so that you could look up, because it had these wonderful rotunda ceiling spaces. So again, hoping to connect to place and honor site and honor it in more expansive ways to the research, but also physically within the experience. This Fuller Craft Museum, it was very much about the moment of bloom and just the moment of spark of the bloom. A piece that I did at Perlman Museum, kind of 5 intricate structure forms and all this winter white bloom activity kind of navigating around this structure. A piece that I did at Northern Clay Center, where I was actually invited first by the Crane paper industry, where our currency is made. And interesting enough, after going through a lot of vetting in terms of security, I was given $1 million shredded offline currency. Every 5 years, our currency is taken offline. And I got to make this piece out of half blue jean handmade paper and half currency. So this is $1 million piece, and its physicality kind of moving around the structure. Everywhere you see green, that's currency. Had a chance to get to do sort of a second rendition to that piece. This is at the Dahl Museum of Art in Missouri. I think that's where it was, Dom. And its whole economics was based on blue jean. The building of this, this sort of blue jean industry kind of helped develop that economic base. And so I got to do a sort of a second rendition of that piece, remade the structural forms, got to respond to the space, and I got to use the currency and the blue jeans over again, but navigating around those unique forms. I did a floor series as a part of the Woman to Watch program at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, in which I studied actually Persian rugs and the bounty of botanical imagery made for hundreds of years through commission in an arid climate. I mean, this was so fascinating to me that this is a history of profuse botanical imagery made in a desert. So they were domesticizing the kind of imagery that they wanted in their domestic spaces. And it's just amazing. Anyway, I built 4 large rug forms, and here you're seeing kind of the large center form. It's like 12 feet across. They're all made from pie shapes, and the pie shapes just slip together. So everything's composite. I also have times in the studio. I'm literally in the studio now, and you can actually see both wall and hanging pieces. We'll come back to that in our discussion time. But between museum projects, I'm making a more object scale and having a relationship with domestic spaces and public spaces, and have a relationship with a gallerist. And so making these wall pieces and letting the research kind of carry over to the wall pieces, in which I'm making simple structure, wooden structure. I am using appropriate material choice, and then part making, and then assembling. But most importantly, I think with the wall series is that I'm navigating and almost denying separateness and boundary. So there's sort of this profusion and cohesion to the form, that I'm interested in more of a harmonious cohesion to the form, where it's sort of, it's denying its separateness in a way, and that it has this sort of visual harmony. So I'm going to take you through quickly some wall pieces. Again, everything's part made. And in this case, the wall series is made in the studio. They're large, like this piece is, I think 10.5 feet across by 8 feet tall. Everything's very lightweight, hangs on simple screws. Things pack up in composite forms, get sent in, homemade boxes and off to fairs or to the gallerist. And most recently, I can share with you a commitment to placing pieces in healthcare facilities. I've placed 3 pieces in hospitals in the last 2 years, and that just feels really great. I mean, like finding the right spot where this sort of prolific, thriving color proliferation, abundance could hopefully bring some joy in a time, or a visual spot that may not have that or desire it. But anything, all of these wall pieces are composite. You can see here I have a sort of, 2 right and left, and bottom right and left, and they're just hung in close proximity, and sort of this color saturation begins to blend and harmonize, hopefully, within the wall pieces. Show that I did recently with painter Joan Snyder. Anybody know Joan Snyder? So here she's in the painting, and I have the visual wall pieces. There's a close-up called Hybrid Swirl, very, very dense. It's actually 4 panels fit together in tight proximity. 2 more pieces where I'm actually using a lot of upcycling of beautiful old antique atlases and books going to the landfill, and coating the paper clay onto one side of the upcycle page, and making form. Yeah, it's really wonderful to be able to work in ceramics and cut with scissors. I mean, it just doesn't happen in my intro classes, but I get to do it in the studio because I have this blend. I'm using textile processes, or I'm taking clay to that sort of textile arena, so that I can do some of these unusual things like weaving. And I'm going to close here quickly because I know you want to hopefully get to some key aspects to discuss, but just a few more wall pieces. A lot of people ask me, do you fire? Yes. Every time you see a hard edge in the form, those are fired parts. So they're a mixture of fired and unfired parts, as well as handmade paper or upcycled industrial papers. So I'm back here to the beginning of the diversity of connecting to place, with an introduction to the Everson Museum installation, an opportunity to be a part of Syracuse, learn more about Syracuse, and bring some essence that connected to me to the work. And I think that's it. Yay. So Elaine asked me to save 30 minutes for you.
Very good. Very good. That's wonderful. I'm getting feedback on my own voice here. Okay. As you were speaking, Rebecca, I was just writing down words, kind of a stream of consciousness a little bit, and in reaction to your work. And I started out looking at them as very much as cocoons, the early pieces, not the early work, but the pieces you showed first in your presentation. And so I thought about the containment and the mystery of the containment, as well as emergence and growth. Those were the first words that came to mind. And then as you kept repeatedly talking about upcycling some industrially or man-made or human-made objects, and hiding that, because no one would know unless you told them that that green was a dollar bill, was currency. And so it's as if you have given them a new and better life than their original intention, which, and I love that kind of juxtaposition of the blue jeans, the currency, and then you're turning them into these amazing composites that take on a completely different life. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, or if someone else wants to take it over and have other thoughts.
I mean, it's true that, I mean, I know that I'm interested in the ultimate filter writing, right?
I'm not-
I'm not a poet.
I'm not hearing you, Rebecca.
Okay.
Is everybody else hearing her being quite, yeah,
Let's see.
that's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, because my mute was off. All right. So I was just going to say, as a visual artist, as a sculptor, I know that I'm interested in striking form. Like, I know that's my business. Like, I'm making things to be experienced. I know I'm not a poet. I know that I'm making, form that can take on potential of language, right? Potential of experience and potential of communication. But also the material gathering, I started with that first slide, where I'm foraging. I actually wrote that on my first slide, that I'm foraging information, but I'm foraging material. So I'm fascinated by the connection of the material. What was it originally used for? When I was in the currency mill, I loved working with all the old chaps that worked in the industry and got the stories. And I would say, oh, this has a lot of flax in the paper. And they'd wink at me because everything was, top secret in terms of, making our money. And I had a camera on me on the whole time. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of security in the situation, but just the connections, the historical connections, I think, is something I'm sensitive to, and that piques my interest when I dig into the research. And having the skills as a paper maker, it's all about breaking material down into another form. So, you boil it normally. I don't need to boil it if it's already been industrially made or industrially used, but it can be boiled. If I grow my own flax, then I boil it, break it down, and then I've got pulp and I can make sheet formation or whatever. But I think papermaking processes sort of lend itself to kind of that new life.
Mm-hmm.
Being a sculptor lent it to, making form to give life, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is an interesting thread that follows through your work. Sometimes obviously, sometimes not. Diane, you have a question?
Yes, one is just a comment to thank you, Elaine, for providing a platform for Rebecca. I have followed her for some years and was happy when she had some recognition from the Renwick Alliance group. And I have a question actually for the group, which is, I know you all are kind of renowned in your own fields as writers, makers, and curators. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Rebecca at various stages, and in seeking a platform to extend the knowledge of her work to the public, just seeking ideas for magazine placement, is this fiber, textile, sculpture, ceramics, and or podcasts, just how to spread the word, because I'm so enamored of her work. And I hope that by seeing her today, you see how she brings it alive with her words and her making. I think she's a remarkable artist in both ways.
Thank you.
Joe, you're muted.
Sorry. I have a dog, so I always mute in case the dog barks. Rebecca, nice to meet you virtually. I've heard a lot about you through some of the students that I mentor. And And I was wondering, is it perceptible if you're standing in your space of these hanging or wall forms, your bloomed pieces, that there's paper and clay, that some is fired and unfired, or is that information that has to be communicated through a label explanation or a text panel? Because I couldn't tell from looking at the images if I could discern the different materials.
I understand. When you stand right up next to the work, you can see it. You can see a sharp edge. You can see, a pointy edge, a sharp edge. That's always the fired form. You can see the handmade paper. It's quite visual and very apparent. You can see glaze. You'll recognize glaze and glaze drips. So it's quite obvious. Maybe what's not obvious, well, obviously what's not obvious is how the handmade paper, where it came from. Was it a plant? Was it an upcycled industrial material? That's not obvious, right?
Mhm.
Unless, although the $1 million was really reflective of the dollar, when you were close to it, you actually saw the security threads in it. You can actually see, kind of the flecks in it that were non-natural, because there's obviously some very non-natural threads in our currency. So I think there are visual truths when you're next to the work. There may definitely be some mystery. There always people ask me, like, how are these all connected? Wait, are these archival? Are they holding up? Like, how do you ship these? And I find those questions quite a lot. But actually, if you walk up to the form, shake the form, bump into the form, they're really hard. So as you can imagine, with adobe architecture, 30 to 40% fiber mixed with clay increases the strength of the clay tremendously. So that's the perfect mix for adobe and adobe architecture around the world. Yes, it's not to a pulp, not paper pulp, but it's grasses that is raked off the field. It's the vernacular, it's the material that's available, gathered and mixed by feet or in wheelbarrow or whatever method. I've been to the brick makers in Mexico, in the Southwest. I think Adobe is incredibly smart. It's just architecturally very smart. It's about availability, but it's also about strength.
Have you ever used hay as part of your mixture?
No, I've used other agricultural products like baling twine or the sisal thread from the burlap industry, but I haven't used hay. I haven't used hay or straw. But I actually have a background because I grew up haying. That was my summer job, to actually help my brother and father hay the fields. And I always say, when I give a long lecture, I always kind of trace those steps. But with this condensed format, so I have to skip over some of those things. But that's how I really learned to be the artist, as I was on a tractor. Like, if anybody knows the haying process, I was the raker. I was the one behind the hay cutter, moving the hay into windrows. They're called windrows. And they're put in windrows for then the baler to come and bale the hay. That was my job. I was the middle person there. And I actually found, that I was not expediting the process. I was actually finding loveliness and beauty of putting those windrows on the land. And I actually found that as a young person, that I was really a maker. Actually, that was my first connection in making.
Right.
Nice.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. And just a last comment. Have you ever done an installation where you have infused a fragrance onto your pieces, because they're all about growth and blooms, and at certain points, especially flowers, emit a fragrance. And with paper, paper contains, it would sustain a fragrance if you impregnated the paper.
Sure.
As we know from 18th century or 19th century Victorian letters, they would be, infused with a fragrance if they were love letters. So I was just thinking, it might be a problem because people are allergic to fragrances in museums, but I was thinking, how Anne Hamilton, when she did her installations, she started to use the smells of spices as part of, to engage another sense, not, there's tactility, but we can't touch a museum. So you know, it's an evocation of tactility.
Yeah, and it's an extension of the experience. I love the idea. I haven't, but it could easily be done, you know, in terms of making paper out of mint or, you know, chamomile or something else that had really strong,
Right.
you
Pleasant, strong and pleasant.
Yeah, yeah,
All
exactly.
right, thank you.
Nancy Service has a comment or a question.
Hi, Rebecca. I really enjoyed your talk, and throughout, when you're talking about the use of willow, I was really zeroing in on that and your embrace of working with the land. And I wondered if you had ever spent much time looking at Northern California basket weavers, because they use the willow and they tend the willow. And when you're talking about peeling the willow and appreciating the bark and then seeing your forms, that was just an association I couldn't stop making. And I wonder if you've had any kind of revelation with that or meditation on basket makers.
Well, definitely. I love baskets, and there's a piece behind me. I don't know if you're able to see the piece behind me. It is the most basket-like forms I've ever made. And inside the baskets, I don't know if you are able to see, but there are these large cast paper clay boulders. So these baskets are carrying the boulders. This is a piece that I'm installing next week at the Maine Contemporary Art Center. And so I actually had to look and teach myself, okay, how does basket makers start their form? So every time I'm doing an installation, I'm sort of relearning, you know, some engineering, and I think that is part of my connection to clay and my field is I am interested in the potential of how far I can take clay and, you know, how I can use it in a unique way. So I've never studied with a basket maker. I've never been around a basket maker, but I zoom right to that section in terms of the historical baskets when I go to the museums. And my husband is a bent willow furniture maker and has a prolific business during the summer making patio furniture. So we're harvesting willow together in the summer. And so, it's all around us. Anybody that knows the Rocky Mountain front, willow is growing anywhere there is space and water. And it's actually considered invasive by the ranchers. The ranchers really want it cut. So we have people that beg to come and actually harvest the willow. But I love basket making history. I love the potential. I love the repetitiveness. It's coil for me. It's coil building for me.
The interesting, because I actually live in an area where there's a lot of willow. I live in the territorial lands of the Washoe, which is up near Lake Tahoe. And I've done a lot of studying, and they actually tend to the willow while they're growing to make sure that they get the lawn,
Focus.
Yeah. So it's really, it's a very fascinating aspect that is this immediate connection to the land in a way that seemed to be integrated into your thought process. So I just wanted to mention that because it just seemed like there were connections there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Astrid, you had a question.
Sorry. Hi, Rebecca, thank you so much for your wonderful and super beautiful presentation. I especially also from your talk in the gallery, you explained so many very interesting points about the inverted vessel objects. Now I have a question. Is there a specific reason why they are hanging from the ceiling?
Yeah, a lot of times people ask me that. Why do I continue to connect to the ceiling? I don't know that I have a logical, perfect answer to that. I do know that I'm interested in the floor. I'm interested in the wall, connecting to the wall. I've used all aspects of the architecture, but I love defying the weight
Gravity.
of ceramics and
Uh-huh.
gravity,
Yes.
I know I'm putting ceramics on its head. Literally, I am taking the
Yeah.
weight and having a field day with it, because, you know, I have a 23 years of teaching, and I know everything is gravity bound. You know, when you're learning in clay, everything's pyramid style because the gravity, you know, has to start wide and go in. You know, I understand that so well, but for me as an educator and as a maker, I've always try to encourage my students to dream what they want to make, and then help them navigate an architecture with the material that could do that. And I think that the joy is there in the studio the same way. It's really about the diversity, the options of building that continues to keep me on my toes and interested, and not kind of worrying about, you know, kind of the narrow lane of what clay has to be. That also is a part of my commitment to try to free myself of that I'm very well trained in terms of being a traditional ceramic artist at Berea College. I don't know if anybody knows Berea College. It's a small liberal arts school where you don't pay to go to school, you work. It's a self-sustaining community. All students work 10 hours a week. I had good skills on the wheel and threw pots for my whole duration, you know, in college. And it was an actualization of sustainability. The students sustained the community. It was a $500,000 business. I'll be completely honest with you. There were 6 of us that threw pots, and we raised $500,000 a year.
Wow.
Through the college, and it's still a very vibrant program. And you know, that was an influential experience as well. You know, to be a part of that kind of community, and to have your investment be a part of, you know, what kept the structure together. I mean, all these threads I know have been influential in the work.
More questions? Discussion? Anna?
So what's next?
Well, the piece behind me is what's absolutely my attention. Currently, I'm using kind of a block and pulley system from the ceiling, which is all about having a system of being able to hoist more weight. So I'm going to use this visual on the ceiling of these baskets with this block and tackle pulley system, so that I'm really kind of playing off these boulders being lifted and carried. So that's the project that's next. That's this next week, and I'll be site installing, and then there are things for the future in September that I'm going to start working on, but haven't started yet. So,
And where will that be installed?
in Maine, Rockland, Maine, at the
Oh.
Contemporary Center, Maine Contemporary Art Center. It's a biennial, and they choose, I think, 22 artists from the New England region, and
Mhm.
it is celebrating kind of the New England artists, and it's a beautiful space in Rockland, Maine.
So what is your history of publication? Where have you been published? Where are your sites set for future publication?
Oh, that's a good question. I have been published by most of the ceramic periodicals. You'll see that on the website, that everything is listed there: Ceramics Monthly, Studio Potter, Ceramics Art and Perception, the Ceramics Magazine in Italy. You caught me off guard. I can't remember
Okay.
the list there, but primarily ceramic publications have taken place, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
Mhm.
In terms of sites, you know, that's a hard question for me. That's more your field than my field. So, you know, I feel like I would be grateful to interview and spend time with someone that could care for presenting the work. So I don't come with any kind of notion of,
Yeah.
you know, where the work should be published. I know that I'm comfortable in the the greater conversation of art making. So I feel sometimes a little less bounded or disciplined or siloed than a lot of people feel, even though I've been predominantly published in ceramics. That doesn't mean that I feel the need for that, because as you can see, the work is already, kind of pushing its elbows against, about how can clay be used, right? And so I'm really comfortable. I've spoken at fiber conferences, and I've certainly nominated students for ISC, the International Sculpture Center. So I'm really quite comfortable not being siloed in a particular way.
Yeah, because I first thought of Sculpture Magazine as a really good potential if anybody has connections there or writes for them. Antra has a question.
Sure.
Thank you, Elaine, and lovely to be here. And Rebecca, lovely presentation. I myself am inspired by nature in my artistic work and my creative work. And so it's just lovely to see how you respond to, what you talked about, the behaviors of nature. I'll take that with me. It's beautiful. My question is about hanging work from the ceiling. And currently I'm also gallery coordinator at Utah State University. And so I'm taking care of the space and facilitating. Growing up, I used to think about art galleries being spaces where you could dig the floor and, do things to the ceiling or like hang things from the ceiling and all of that. But maintaining a space, that has been something like I'm not the curator, so that's great. But I don't think anybody who asks me, oh, can I hang this from the ceiling? And I'm like, I can't give you permission, and I don't know how I would go about doing something like that. So my question to you is, because you've done exhibitions in 2 different places that you presented, maybe more, where you've done something at the ceiling, are you in dialogue with the people who actually create a contraption so that you can hang things from the ceiling? Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, there's no, everything's so well planned. So because I'm working for a year, 12 to 16 months, ahead of the mark, that there's conversations already with the preparators. There's conversations already with, all of the staff, and sometimes even checking to see what the substrates are. So they'll look into the architectural drawings to see, are there studs under the ceiling? And I hear everything. Sometimes it's, concrete board underneath the sheetrock. Sometimes it is just metal framework under the sheetrock. I mean, there's a variety of circumstances, but to me, that's all a part of the process. The communication, the navigation, the potential of what's possible. And for me, I'm honoring the space. I'm working with the staff. I'm communicating with the possibilities. And so usually that's unraveled way ahead of time. And then they let me know, you can anchor a screw, you have to work from this spot because those are where the studs are. And they usually let me know the realities. And then we also go over through the safety, because I do a lot of docent teaching and a lot of interviews on safety. How is this, wheelchair safe? How is it children safe? And I always illustrate, you can bump into the piece, a handbag can rub against it, you can bump into it. It's not going anywhere. They are securely connected. And the forms are hard. You can knock on them. They're Adobe dried hard. So those are kind of natural circumstances that come up in the process. And I just try to listen and hear and see where my invitations are or where the boundaries might be, and then just really respect all of that and come up with a system that everyone feels good about. In terms of literally the connection is super easy. I usually just do simple little wooden moldings that get, screwed into the ceiling, at least 2 screws into a piece of molding. And then the support system is literally just kind of tapped into a V shape in the molding. So the support system, the pole comes down, and there's just literally connections from the molding to the pole. So it's quite simple, actually.
Great. Great. And it seems like you're working with the staff, and you yourself are installing this
I'm always there.
contraption after you have the plan.
Yeah,
Great.
I do work with preparators, because I can't be on the ladder and on the floor at the same time.
Sure.
So
Yes.
I do work with preparators, and I have a wonderful assistant, Addie, who works for me 1 day a week, and she travels to all the sites with me, and she knows the work really well. And together, the two of us are working with the preparators, and it's, the connection is actually quite easy. I was not there for the deinstall at the Everson. We just sent simple instructions how to deinstall, and they said it was really, really, quite easy. So it was just like, 7 points, wrap it first, then wrap it again, and then get to the top, unconnect, someone supports, lay it on the ground, de-stick it, because all the sticks are made with sort of a screw that goes between both pieces. So they're double-ended screws, so all the sticks can come apart in 4-foot sections so that everything can be shipped.
Wow.
Sort of in a reasonable length, because I can't ship, something that's, 13 feet in length. So everything's sort of in sections.
Yeah.
So you're not only creating the art, but also doing all this organization and planning of like wrapping it up. And that's great. Thank you.
That's part of installation making. I think that's really different. When I see someone packing their show and it's in 3 boxes, I think, wow, that's really different than what I do.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate it.
Cynthia Morelli had a comment in the chat. I find suspending clay, I like this thought, along with the incorporated airiness and space in Rebecca's work, gives me a sense of liberating the material. And she says, thank you. I think that's an interesting.
I'm going to take that with me too. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. It's always interesting to see what other people see in your work, isn't it?
That helps us think smarter, sharper, from a different angle, all of the above. Absolutely. I haven't been a part of your group, but I did catch one of your lectures. I think it was maybe in the fall. And there was it was a theme of kind of high touch, low touch. Those were not your words, but it was kind of looking at the sort of irreverence of clay. How did you frame that? Was that how it was framed? Irreverence in clay, kind of, or was it used like the lack of beauty? There was this topic that had some tension between, I always call it in the educational environment, the high touch and low touch, someone that highly touches and tames the clay, and then sort of low touch, sort of untaming the clay. That made me think of that a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
That last comment.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Or freeing, because I tend to lean a little bit more in that direction of sort of, I'm not a smotherer, I don't smooth it over and over again, but I'm mentoring emerging artists that do. We all have this, we're on the spectrum, from very highly touched to almost not touched at all, and kind of bringing out sort of the wildness of the material. And I thought that topic in your discussion group was really terrific.
Okay, I know you've been on the mailing list for quite a while, so you've gotten the links and things. Yeah. There are just some nice comments. Anna had to leave, but she said, wonderful. Thanks, Rebecca. Wonderful to see your work and hear your talk about it. Have to run. Kurt Manzel said, visual, verbal, and conceptual excellence. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
And Rita Donham said, yes, it's immensely refreshing to see your artwork hanging in the gallery space instead of taking up floor space. And then Kurt added, okay, engineering too, after you talk about that. Nancy Service says she really enjoyed your presentation. Rita also said the work is fun, and so are you. Linda Lighton said, thanks, Rebecca, wonderful talk. And Joe Loria said, informative and well presented. Thank you for your thoughts and energy. And Judy Seckler, who's also an LA writer, said, wonderful to see clay used in such fascinating way. Thanks, Rebecca. And as you talk about that tactile, I was wondering if you had any record, or if you were there when the children went through your exhibition. Did they touch? Did they get on the floor and look inside?
I did some docent training and they asked me my boundaries and I said, obviously they just can't jump and hang on it, right? They can't hang on it. That's too far, right? But that they were, they were going to let them in groups of 10 so that there wasn't, so there was room to experience it. And I told them, let them be physical, let them physically move through it. And they were like, we don't have any running policies. We don't do skipping policy. I said, well, that's your boundaries. I trust all of that. But if something gets touched lightly or bumped lightly, there's no harm. But I actually found that the idea of having fifth graders there was, I thought, what a post-pandemic great experience.
Yeah.
Let them experience something physical and to move their own body through it. That's great. So I thought that was terrific. The only record I didn't have any pictures, but they did give me some of the kids' drawings and some of the children's comments. And so that was really
great.
fun.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I want to say to all of you writers out there, if you have interest in writing for a publication about Rebecca's work, just email me and I can give you Rebecca's contact information. But feel free. I think we need to get her work out there. Mary Jane Edwards posted, joy and enthusiasm, much appreciated seeing the work and hearing you generously share your process. And then Linda Lighton wanted to know if there are crumbs from the work that fall on the floor.
Yeah, so often, like when something's shipped, there might be a little pebble or a little something that would flake off. And I always put a disclaimer in the box, a little crumble, no harm. Huge separation, call me, crumble, no problem.
Right.
None whatsoever. But thank you all for having me, just a joy to be here. And thank you for your work. And for the best of my ability, I'll jump into your talks when I can.
Good.
But thank you for having me. It was very
That's
generous.
great. Any final words? Okay. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thank you to everyone for being here. We'll see you next month.
Thanks again. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.